Hi everyone, so Diablo 4 Season 8 has been out for roughly 3 weeks so far, and with Season 9 just around the corner already, or the PTR at least, that I will be obviously covering, it's time to slowly wrap it up for me. So I want to give my thoughts, my experiences, just what I have done, and my suggestions to the developers, of course, about Season 8 and the future, and hope that we're gonna see maybe some updates coming soon here. So I prepared a few notes just to give you a bit of an idea of what I have been doing, and I will be also talking about a fair share of problems that the game still has. I've already made some other videos, for example, about Overpower, just a dedicated video that is a huge topic, I think, and some other issues. And then I will follow up with a bit of a wish list for the different classes. So I'll go through this here point by point and just kind of like talk through it. And while I think that there are a lot of problems with the game still and a lot of work left to be done, I do think that this was actually a pretty good season. I've been blasting quite a lot, so you can see this here. So in like around 3 weeks, I accumulated like 250-ish hours. So something like 12 to 14 hours every day. I was blasting pretty hard. And I think for the first time ever, I actually made all 6 classes in the same season. So this has not happened before, I think. And I actually had really a blast playing multiple builds on every class of this. So while obviously there's a lot of stuff that needs fixing, it was a really good season because of a very diverse meta, and we had the difficulty revamp that really contributed to me enjoying the game a lot more than before. So I think those two things together really made a solid overall experience, despite the season theme being extremely lackluster, repetitive, and kind of boring. And you know, a bunch of other issues basically. But yeah, as you can see here, I've played something like 15 builds or so. I do have to say I had the most fun with the Spiritborn actually. It's just kind of like my kind of class, I gotta say, together with the Rogue. You know, I'm maining those two classes largely. But I decided to actually start a Sorc. We have a, like this is the indicator for when I created the class. So this was my first one, so I went with that, but I died to a bug. I actually had my first death since the expansion on the Sorc here this season, thanks to the Andariel bug. And then I had a second death as well on my Necromancer lately, which was a lag. So I had 2 deaths this season, which usually doesn't really happen, but it is what it is. Overall, it didn't really take out the enjoyment of the season for me, and even playing a lot of kind of like, you know, B tier builds or so, that I was doing, you know, stuff like Stinger or Blizzard or something like that. You know, some stuff is not really as strong as like the crazy stuff that a lot of other people are doing, but it was still a really enjoyable experience overall. But it also gave me a pretty good overview of where all the different classes are at. Now, I didn't play every single build on every single class, but I do understand like some of the like common pain points, for example, very well now, I think. And I will also be talking about that for every single class a little bit, and some stuff that I hope to see addressed. I hope you're enjoying this video so far, but before we continue, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Exit Lag. You might remember those guys. They have sponsored me way back in the Diablo 4 open beta, and now they're back with a vengeance for Belial's return. If you don't know what Exit Lag is about, well, it's this nice little tool here that allows you to improve the speed and stability of your internet connection to the gaming server that you're playing. So for example, for Diablo 4, I can just press this button here. It will analyze the fastest routes to the server and then optimize my latency and give me a faster ping. I've been trying this out since the season start, and it's actually helped me quite a lot. Usually my latency is really bad in Diablo 4, something like in the range of 90 to 100. But with Exit Lag, it actually more often than not drops to even below 70. And the best part is there are 1,200 games in their library that this works with. Diablo 4 is not the only one. There's a ton of stuff. In fact, a lot of people that I showed this to on my stream, for example, told me that they're using this especially in shooter games, and also a bunch of others in like MMOs, for example. And I can also show this to you in-game. So for example, if you look at the bottom left corner right now, my latency is at 72. So especially if you're living in some, let's say, more remote areas far away from the original servers and latency is generally bad, or your server stability is lacking, then Exit Lag might help you out. And if you are not really sure, well, you can try it out for free for 3 days with the trial. So if you want to find more information about Exit Lag and check this out, then click the link in the description or the pinned comment. And let's go back to the rest of the video. Now, let's talk about like what actually happened in Season 8 here. So we had a bunch of pretty big updates. Let's talk about the season theme first of all. So this is like a pretty important topic for a lot of people. Not so much for me, to be honest. Generally, personally, I don't really care that much about season themes. I just want the game to be good and enjoyable. And this season theme in particular was really bad, I guess. The incursions were just kind of annoying, not really rewarding. No one really cared. And well, you just played them for like 3 hours, you got all your powers, and then you just like left forever, I guess. And you got a bunch of like free season rep. I guess a lot of people enjoyed like the easy mythics that we got after they enabled the scroll, spectral ash, like crafting basically with the season rep board. But outside of that, it was like just kind of like a whatever season theme, I gotta say. So the powers were like a little impactful, I think. It was just like a little bit of like a stat stick, extra bonus that was worse than other similar themes we had in the past, and that was about it. Now, I think it's not really a good idea to invest way too much into a season theme anyway. If you just decide to throw it away completely after the season is over anyway. We've seen this with like almost every single thing that Blizzard has ever introduced in Diablo 4. It gets introduced as a seasonal thing, and then it just never comes back. We don't have Malthas, we don't have Millennium Tunnels, we don't have Bloodseekers even, like we have nothing basically. A few of those things got later on like transformed into new systems or updated systems, like we have the Pit that is like similar to the Abattoir of Zir from back in the day and these kind of things. But realistically, all the season stuff always vanishes and it's kind of wasted, I feel. So I don't really mind that the season theme was small and lackluster, but I think a lot of other people do. And for the future, I would maybe hope to see some more, creativity at the very least. It doesn't have to be bigger, but more creative would be a good idea, I think. Then we have the difficulty scaling. So as I just said, this was actually a large factor for me of why I enjoyed the game much more than before. I felt before the season 8, T4 was just kind of a joke. We had a lot of power creep in the last few seasons. Lots of buffs across the board for all the classes. Like T4, it was kind of like just a joke, especially on alts. Like you just made the alt and you are in T4. And even these days, you can still kind of do that if you have a good bunch of paragons and items lying around. Yeah, you can make a fresh alt and you're like in Torment 4 in like an hour or two. And I think that's okay for alts, but for the first character, it does feel like too easy, at least in the previous seasons. And now it has gotten a lot better, I think. So I actually spent a significant amount of time farming Torment 3, especially on hardcore with like the bosses and stuff. That was a bit tight sometimes. And well, you definitely have to try a little bit to go into Torment 4 if you're not playing like some Giga S tier build or something like that, which I found to be very good. So if you're talking about like especially not top tier builds, let's say, somewhere like in the range of like A to B, like basically these builds here, I think the progression is kind of like in the perfect spot for when it comes to, going to Torment 4, powering up, getting strong enough to actually take on the T4 bosses, and then eventually pushing the pit a little bit higher. So for those builds here, I think it was just like kind of too easy. And, we have a bunch of those there that kind of like struggle too much. Even like maybe the lower Bs are also kind of in that territory. But yeah, everything else here is actually in a really good spot. And I think this is kind of like where we should have all of the builds in like the kind of the same area. So we need to bring some of those down. We need to bring a lot of them up. And then it's going to be really good, I think, for the future. This also leads me to the next point, build diversity. I think build diversity is actually at an all-time high. We don't have any crazy giga bugged outliers. We do have a lot of bugs on some builds, especially at Sorcs and stuff, but nothing that is just like, 1,000 times stronger than the next best thing, like, Spiritborn style. And in general, every class had really good builds, actually, and some of them actually multiple. And if you go below the S tier builds, for example, there's a lot of stuff in A and B tier builds in this territory that I just described, where, every class has like at least a handful of builds or more. And that was actually really refreshing. You can kind of just load up whatever. And, as you just saw here, like I've been playing almost no S tier builds at all, basically. And I had a really good time, trying out a lot of different stuff here on all of the different classes. And yeah, for some it's easier than for others and so on. But overall, I gotta say that this was definitely the, most enjoyable in terms of balance overall. So this was actually very well done here. I think if balancing gets a bit of like a bigger priority and bug fixing especially, like, we're talking about the Sorcs, for example, And, in general, like some of the builds were nerfed from Season 7, but then kind of remained the top dogs in Season 8 again, like all the Earthquake stuff on the Barb, and then, Cataclysm Druid, like all the stuff just came back again that we already saw last season. Death Trap was also a top build, Bloodwave was a top build, Bone Spirit was a top build, so everything kind of like remained where it was, just the gap got smaller from Season 7 to Season 8. So the gap was definitely way larger last season compared to what it is now. So the S tier builds are like maybe 10 times as powerful as the A tier builds, and not like 100 times or something. So that was definitely a step in the right direction, but we still have 2 strong builds up here, some of them with like way too ridiculous mechanics, like talking about this, for example. Yeah, while it is super fun to play Death Trap Rogue right now, it just kind of does everything too well. It's like it has no weakness, right? So that is certainly a concern when it comes to like the overall like class balance and build diversity. For example, like how could a Heartseeker Rogue ever hope to be, something competitive, right? To like Death Trap Rogue, for example. Are we just gonna shoot like 200 Heartseeker arrows per shot or something? Well, obviously not. So I guess something would have to happen for these kind of cases to be a little bit more in line with others. But yeah, overall, I gotta say it was actually pretty good. Now let's talk about the boss ladder. I gotta say, I don't really like all the old boss system all that much, and there are various problems here. So we got the boss revamp. First of all, we got a bunch of new bosses, which I like, and I also really enjoy that the bosses are way harder. I think that's also pretty cool because it actually gives you a bunch of challenges that you can try to accomplish. So especially for like T4 bosses, you definitely have to have a pretty good character, or you have to play pretty well in order to beat them. And that's pretty cool, even if there's not really a huge reward attached to that. But I do have some problems with the boss ladder, which is number one, we get way too many boss mats from Undercity runs that are just not really target farmable. So you just like spam Titan tributes in Undercity, you farm way too much Undercity, which is just kind of like way too repetitive. There's not really enough excitement in those runs. And then you get a bunch of random boss mods, and then you have to farm all these random bosses, and then maybe you get lucky and occasionally a Belial pops up, and then you can go Belial, and Belial is just 10 times better than all the other bosses. So I feel like this whole cycle is like not really well thought out right now. In the past, for example, we had like, you target farm a certain thing to get the boss mods for a certain boss, and you kill that boss to get certain uniques, and now it's just kind of all over the place, and I don't like that at all. I want more target farming, I want more agency, and I also like these extra random uniques that are now added to the loot pool, kind of like diluting the stuff that you actually want to farm with random stuff you don't care about. I don't like that at all. And on top of this, we have 3 bosses that have exactly the same loot table, which I find an absolute waste. Like, why is there not like, 3, 4 uniques on every single boss? And, you go farm that boss and that's it. I want to get that item, I go kill that boss. And in order to go do that boss, I go do that activity. Like, I really think that was a really good system. And okay, there is still the tributes, and sometimes you get like these random boss drops. That's okay. It's fine to get some random mods in some random places, but the way that this currently works is they just have like infinite sustain of Titan tributes, and it's just kind of like all over the place, and I don't like that at all. So I think that at least should be addressed. We should go back to more target farming, and not to like everything can drop everywhere all the time. I think that's just like, it doesn't really feel that great, because you don't have any choices really. So overall, I think the system will definitely need some tweaking here. I want to see all the items distributed. I would like to see more ancestral drops as well, like trying to farm up your own uniques. Like, I actually kind of gave up on even trying to get ancestral versions, just like a 1GA of like, some kind of decent roll for my items. In some cases, because I would just have to go and farm a boss like 200 times in order to have like a decent chance or so, because the loot table is so diluted with way too many uniques, and then all the random uniques, and the ancestral drop rate is really low now because they nerfed it. So overall, it just didn't really feel good. And not only that, but then also comes the issue that the bosses are not just good to get the uniques, but they're also just kind of the answer to everything. They're the best for the runes, they're the best for rare crystals, they're the best for Forgotten Souls, they're the best for all of the salvage mods. Like, there is nothing that you don't get in the best way possible from bosses, besides, I don't know, glyph upgrades, I suppose, or something like that. And I guess legendaries, but legendaries are not such a problem. You get, legendary is way easier than the uniques anyway, so this is just on the way. So overall, I think, you know, all of the extra benefits from the bosses, like all the extra mats, all the extra, even gold, like this is actually the best source of gold as well, even as an SSF player. Like all of that stuff needs to be redistributed elsewhere. Like I want to go, I'm fine paying my Duriel tax every season, you know, that's what I called it. You know, I found the bosses, I get my mythics, I get my uniques, and then I don't want to see those bosses again, like ever. I don't want them to be good for anything besides that. That's basically what I'm getting at. So, you know, like the runes, I mean, maybe that's okay, but there should be at least something else for runes, and harmony tributes ain't it. And then, you know, the materials, you know, we have Legion events, we have Overworld events, we have Nightmare Dungeons, you know, there are so many places where we can put something to target farm those materials that, you know, help us to actually make our gear, masterwork our gear, and so on. And if I ever run out of any of them, if I ever go down to 0 red crystals, which is happening to a lot of people, or Forgotten Souls as well, there are some bottlenecks like that. The answer is always just farm more bosses, lol. And that is absolutely horrendously bad. You know, this is like an uninstall angle basically for most people. So I think that needs to change. Besides that, yeah, I think the ancestral drop rates are maybe nerfed too much, and something should be done there as well. Then we have the patch cycle. So what I'm referring to is just like kind of the stated goal of what Blizzard tried to do with this season. They said there's no mid-season patch, and they're trying to fix stuff in like the first 1-2 weeks. And they've actually done a relatively good job at that. Now, okay, the Infernal Horde counter is still broken, but I mean, that's a pretty minor thing. And overall, you know, they fixed the Varshan stuff because it was, you know, killing the servers, which was somewhat expected. Some people got upset, okay, but it is what it is. And overall, I gotta say, it was a pretty good kind of like first week and second week experience, like with those fast patches, you know, fixing some bugs and so on. And I really hope that the devs keep that up. So that is a way better way of doing it than we had in the past, where Blizzard was just kind of like indecisive and waiting too long. And then there was this like mid-season patch at some point, and, you know, kind of like whatever for most people. Most people don't really come back. You know, they do their stuff, they move on, and this is what it is. And I think that Blizzard should just kind of like keep embracing that. And I hope that it's the same system we're going to see going forward as well. So this is kind of like all my input on this topic here. Now, let's talk about some other stuff here. Game problems. So tempering is a pretty small topic, I guess, but it's also there. Tempering is a very frustrating system for a lot of people. It's the first step in the item, you know, crafting process, and it's also the one where your item can actually be destroyed effectively. So if you don't get the right tempers, the item is worthless, and this is it. Now, I personally don't have such a major problem with this, but it is kind of weird when, you know, you finally get an upgrade and you have like this 2GA version of the item with, you know, exactly the same stats instead of a 1GA, for example, and then you have to go temper, and then you break the item, and then you don't actually have the upgrade that you were just so happy about finding, right? So I think this is a bit of an issue. I think if we want to destroy items, which is very good and very healthy for the game, you know, we find many copies of good items, and there should be a way to destroy items in a way that is not just salvaging, but in a way that is like, you know, Gamba basically. And I think that's good, but it should not be the first step in the item process, right? So there should maybe be like some, you know, more, you know, reliability on how tempering works. Maybe there could be a solution where you just can't fail it or something like that, and, you know, like totally at least maybe you can choose the stat or whatever. There's plenty of solutions, but at the very least, I think that it could take out a lot of the frustration that people experience with getting upgrades that actually just turn out to be salvage fodder, basically. So that seems like it's just causing bad feelings for no reason, and something that could be addressed for the future. Then we have Masterworking. This is actually a much bigger problem, I think. I'd also talked about this extensively on various, you know, occasions, but I think Masterworking needs a big overhaul, and it seems like we might be getting something, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Masterworking is just a system that doesn't really make any sense right now. So the main problem I have with Masterworking is that in order to try to improve your character by resetting an item and then remasterworking it to a better outcome, you have to first lose some of the power that a character currently has, and then there's a high chance that you're not getting back to the power that you previously had. If you don't have a ton of gold and a ton of materials, if you just run out of materials halfway and you don't actually save the previous state of the item, for example, you just, reset your item at 12 out of 12 masterwork, trying to, get the right hit on 4, getting the right hit on 8, and then getting the right hit on 12. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense, basically, right? So a lot of people kind of just like get into this like very stale situation where you just have a bunch of good items and they're like good enough, and then you find an upgrade and you just don't want to masterwork it because you already went so deep on the previous item, for example. So a lot of people talk about, for example, just saving the masterwork crits, so resetting only 4 ranks at a time instead of all ranks at once. I think that would be a relatively good solution. There could be other solutions to that system as well, but something needs to be done, because I think masterworking, especially for like more like end game focused players, is a major factor in like just sucking out the fun and the enjoyment of the game. It's just a very frustrating system. It's extremely grindy, which by itself is not a problem, but the fact that, you can grind an entire day, then try to upgrade your item and end up worse than before, that is a problem. So I think at the very least you should not be able to downgrade your character, and whatever else happens is fine. And it could even be like, you save, the masterwork crits that you want, or you can even choose the masterwork crits and it costs more or something like that. That is not really such a problem. It could be a grindy system, especially the last ranks, for example, but the way that works right now, it just is horrible, I think. So something should happen here. Overpower, I did talk about this in depth about, how crazy and how imbalanced it is. Just the TLDR, with the expansion launch, the base life of characters changed, but the overpower formula did not, which means that these days we get a lot more damage from overpower than we did pre-expansion, and this just caused, a multitude of balance issues ever since, basically. So in Season 6, Season 7, Season 8, we've seen it again and again and again. Overpower meta, everything that can overpower will overpower, and it does also lead to very stale itemization choices, very stale gameplay as well. Actually, very bad gameplay in many cases as well, where, you do the overpower, you one-shot everything, you don't overpower, you hit like a red noodle, you can't even kill a trash mob. That is just like way too much of a gap here between the overpower and the non-overpower, even on builds that build into it and try to get them, reliably. Sometimes you just can't make it reliable enough to feel good. And there's plenty of examples out there that just feel terrible to play compared to what it was, like a year ago, for example, just because overpower is so ridiculous right now. So something should be done here. Then we have Overworld. Overworld, I mean, it doesn't really have like, let's say, a problem per se, but I just put it into this category here. I think it's kind of sad that we don't really see more stuff going on with Overworld content. For example, Hell Tides is like a very outdated thing these days. No one is really farming it. We have like, sometimes these seasonal events that are kind of just there, but also no one really cares. In general, there's like these events, like, Overworld events or whatever, like these random events. No one does those or cares about those. And especially once you're in the like T4 speed farming territory with a decked out character, everything just feels so trivial, like Nightmare Dungeons as well, like, everything is like the same difficulty anyway, right? So we outscale the content relatively soon at some point, at least with the good builds, and then there's like no further scaling, no further excitement, there's no juicing, and overall I would just hope to see more things going on here in the open world. We have a lot of instance content right now with hordes and pit and these kind of things that people are doing largely. The bosses as well, I guess. Bosses is like always a big thing that is like a huge time sink, and all of that is kind of okay, but I would just hope to see that we get more stuff with like this massive world that we have. There's like not enough going on, I think. So we'll see. And then we have the pit. So pit also, I think I made a huge video about this at some point, but the TLDR is pit still has glaring issues, like not enough monsters to complete the run sometimes, backtracking and all that kind of stuff. So some simple fixes would be just, adding another floor, for example, or, just, fixing the progression in some way or something like that. Like this is like huge wipe off moment every time, you run into those dead ends and there's no monsters, and you run back like 1 minute to try to find the last guy in the last corner that you forgot or something like that. Horrible. So that needs to change at the very least, and that needs to be changed soon. Then we also have pit pushing, which doesn't really concern that many people, but overall, I gotta say, pushing is just terrible in Diablo 4 compared to Diablo 3, and it's just not really fun. A lot of people are like crying out for leaderboards, you know, we want pit leaderboards and all these kind of things, but I'm not sure if you're really asking for the right thing here right now. If you get leaderboards in the current iteration of the pit, it's going to be a disaster, I think. The pit is just not fun to push, and I say this as someone who built an entire career with pushing in Diablo 3. Like solo pushing is the thing I've done for 10,000 hours, and I hate it in Diablo 4. It's just not fun. Like the main problem is that, you know, there's like no strategy, there's no kind of like skill expression. It's largely just a gear check or like a DPS check in that case, which, for example, compared to Diablo 3 is just the complete opposite of what we had there. There was a lot of, you know, tactical and like strategic knowledge that you could apply and, you know, show that you are a better player than someone else, for example, on a leaderboard, which is nearly impossible in Diablo 4. Now, there's obviously always some kind of skill element involved, but that part of it is just way too small. So I think leaderboards in the current pit would just not make sense. We need like some major shakeup of what the pit actually is in order to introduce leaderboards for them. But with that being said, I think some small changes could be made with a big impact right now. For example, there's people that also like to do like the unofficial pit leaderboard stuff right now, right? On like helltides.com, for example. And in order to just make that more exciting and more fun and, you know, kind of like a short-term solution, maybe we could just, you know, make the pit a shorter timer, for example. So, you know, it would automatically force us into lower tiers and shorter boss fights and shorter elite fights, because one of the things that also becomes very boring is just that everything's just such a damage sponge at some point. Like everything is just so tanky and you can't really do anything besides just whack away until everything dies. And you have like these 8-minute boss encounters on many builds, and it's just kind of an awful situation for everyone involved, basically. If there was a shorter timer, we would have to go lower tiers, and we couldn't just like whack away a boss like for 8 minutes or something, but maybe only 2 or 3 if the timer is, let's say, half as long. You know, if you make an 8-minute pit timer instead of a 15-minute pit timer, for example, that could already be like a little solution. And then, of course, you know, long term, especially looking towards the expansion and looking towards the leaderboards that Blizzard has announced, I would definitely hope to see more updates to make, you know, a push mode that is closer to what we know from Diablo 3 at least, because Diablo 3 did that really well, and Diablo 4 is terrible right now when it comes to pushing. So let's just hope that, you know, some big stuff is happening here. Last point about the pit is also glyph leveling. Now, it has been made easier. We had like a season blessing as well that gave us an extra pit level up, and in general, like, we can now just speed farm our glyphs all the way to level 100, for example. You don't even have to do Torment 4 content to level your glyphs to level 100 now, for example. But a lot of people actually just don't like glyph leveling very much. Now, it doesn't have really such a huge impact to level your glyphs past, let's say, 70, 80 or so anyway. If we really don't want to, you know, we're talking about, you know, relatively negligible damage increases. So I think that is generally fine, but it seems like for a lot of people it does matter if they can finish their glyphs in a, you know, reasonable manner. It might also just be a problem of the pit not being fun enough for a lot of people with, you know, some stuff I described, like the pushing is unfun, we have the backtracking issues and whatever. If those things were fixed, maybe people would think differently about it, but it does appear that people also want to get some alternative to glyph leveling at least. And especially now that we can level glyphs in extremely low tier runs, there's not really a good argument to keep it entirely confined to the pit anymore. So there could be maybe a solution in the future where other content types also give us glyph level ups, even if it's like very small and incremental and low chances or something like that. You know, it's just like doing a low tier pit run or so. But, you know, if someone really just doesn't want to farm the pit, then maybe we let them farm something else and slowly then raise their glyph levels, for example. So that would be another solution here as well. And let's talk about the classes here. So this is my class wish list. Having played all of the classes lately, and also like I talk to a lot of people, like I have like the entire Masterworld team, and, you know, I kind of know what's going on in general, let's say, across the classes. There's a lot of stuff going on here where I feel like we definitely need a bit of like a shake-up, or some stuff needs to be addressed that is just kind of like way too whack right now. So let's start with the Barbs here. I think Barbs are overall like a pretty solid class, very strong, tanky, easy, easy to build and so on. One problem that I have right now is just Earthquake is very dominant, and Mighty Throw also has a bunch of like really weird stuff going on with like Overpower and like snapshotting, I think, and so on. So those two archetypes are probably like a bit too high end, and then the rest, like especially core skills, for example, are just not really in a good spot. There's a lot of builds that like rely on actual like weapon swings that are just like weak these days, and I would hope to see, less EQ, more kapow, basically. So just as I wrote it here, I think that sums it up pretty well. So that would be cool. Long term, there could also be maybe a bit of like a revamp of like the class mechanic. I think the technique slot and that stuff is just kind of like relatively boring and not impactful enough. In fact, I would actually like to see these like weapon effects as part of the weapons themselves for everyone. So that would be kind of interesting, if like weapons had way more impactful implicits for everyone, and maybe the Barbs get something else. But I guess that's like, expansion territory here or so. But that is something that I had on my mind for a long time. Overall, yeah, Barbs, it would be nice if we get like a bit more like core skill action here or so. Druids are actually doing pretty well. It's probably like the overall best balanced class if we discount Cataclysm. Cataclysm is like way above, and then we have a lot of builds in the A and B tier, and that's it. There's no bad builds on Druid basically. Maybe something like Tornado definitely needs like the most of a buff or so, but in general, like everything is kind of playable at least, and there's like lots of different archetypes, lots of variety. The human druid stuff didn't really pop off, but maybe with more support in the future, or more like uniqueness as well. I guess it kind of just lacks something that makes human druid like more interesting than just another way of scaling your setup, for example. So there could be something here. Yeah, overall, I think the dominance of Cataclysm is too big, and then maybe something weaker builds could get bumped up, but otherwise I'm relatively happy actually with where Druids are landing. Then we have the Necros. I do have to say, I did not really enjoy the Necro that much, and I will probably not return to the class really soon, unless there's like, a big cool new build or something like that. I did enjoy Blight, for example, a lot, because it felt a bit like, multi-shot, but with dots. And yeah, but besides that, it was just not really such a crazy good experience playing Necro from my perspective. Especially, it's like a very slow and clunky class, and that's actually true. And the thing is, it's not slow because it doesn't have a mobility skill. Like a lot of people are always moaning, oh, please give something to the Necros. And honestly, I'm like 99% sure that this is actually going to happen in the expansion. I don't think that the lack of a mobility skill is actually the problem. The problem is just like clunky mechanics. Like you press corpse tendrils, you wait like 2 seconds, and then stuff gets pulled in. You have like, you reach level 60, you open your Paragon boards. I look at the Paragon boards and I just despair, because there is like, mandatory Flesh Eater. Like I have to use corpses. I can't really get around it on some builds because there is no Paragon boards that actually help me. So stuff like that, for example, we can't actually try to not use those clunky mechanics because there is no alternative. This is just kind of like a problem in general on the class. It's what makes it kind of so slow and clunky. And I think we could alleviate that in the future, maybe. And then I think Necros, power-wise, they're in a really good spot. Some builds are obviously pretty OP. And in general, though, I think Necro has a lot of good stuff going for them. And if they become more smooth to play, that would be a great boon. Then we have the Rogues. So for the Rogues, I think Science has gone too far, actually, when it comes to Shadow Clones. Shadow Clones are literally on every single Rogue build right now. Besides the 2 builds that cannot have Shadow Clone, because those are Death Trap and Rain of Arrows, and that's it. So the problem with Shadow Clone is it's not like a true like damage mimic, but it's like kind of like a scuffed minion that tries to do the same thing that you do, but then it misses the target, or it just attacks the wrong guy, and it also doesn't work with half the stuff on Poison Imbue, and it's just scuffed. That's basically the only word I have for this. I think that Shadow Clone needs to be changed to something that is like a true copy and cannot be altered. It needs to be like a true damage copy of your character, of like whatever percentage value you have. And there needs to be no shenanigans like, pet buffs, summon buffs, all this kind of stuff. Because right now we have the situation where, the clone does all the damage, you do none of the damage. This is what we had with like Wave of Light Monk in Diablo 3. And while Wave of Light was a really cool build, that clone mechanic was just the worst. And now we copied that into Diablo 4, but for every single build on Rogue. That's the worst case scenario, to be honest. Like, this needs to change. I think all these clone fixes, like, I don't know. Like, my recommendation originally was just delete the Shadow clone because it was so bugged and didn't do anything for like the first 1.5 years. And now they just kind of overcorrected way too hard, basically. And, well, I really want to go back to the timeline where they would have deleted it, to be honest. So this is like my recommendation here. And also, you know, I would like to see some other updates to rogues. Like, the stagger problem is huge. Many people that played Rogue probably didn't really notice it this season, but if you go outside of the bubble of Death Trap being ridiculous and also very good at killing bosses without anything, well, you will notice that you just can't kill bosses on rogues if you don't stagger them. And these days we don't really stagger stuff anymore because Fist of Fate got gutted. So yeah, rogues have this general problem, even with the nerfs to the utility aspects that were like pseudo-offensive, you know, like Frostbitten and Noxious Eyes and these kind of things. Are now offensive aspects, so we actually do have less of an impact of a stagger these days than we did in Season 7, for example, but the problem remains, rogues don't kill bosses without stagger, and that needs to be addressed as a whole as well. Not just on the rogue, there's also other scenarios on, you know, classes where you get like insane boosts during the stagger, and then if something goes wrong, or you do like a high tier pit boss that just doesn't get staggered anymore at some point, it just feels off, so that needs to be addressed. And yeah, like wish list wise, I guess, you know, we would like to see some old school builds come back. You know, where's the Andariel Rogue? Where's like the Flurry RF? You know, where's Shadow Imbue? You know, there's a lot of stuff here that I would like to see come back for the future. Now, let's talk about the Sorcs. Well, a lot of stuff is going on with the Sorcs. They are currently by far the strongest, thanks to many bugs. And I think all of those need to be fixed ASAP. So at least with like the start of Season 9. But of course, we also need some kind of compensation if that happens. I think number one priority here is Enlightenment. That is not only bugged, but also just terrible to play with. It's like way too much Feast and Famine, basically, which is largely due to the bugs. But even without the bugs, we have this problem that you do all the damage when Enlightenment is up, you do no damage when Enlightenment is down, and that is used on like all of the builds almost, besides the burning builds, basically. And that is just not good. Like, I think this should be maybe something a bit of like a spectrum. Maybe it's like a ramping buff and then it slowly decays, or something like that, you know, Wild Heart Hunger style, maybe somewhere in that line. Maybe that would be good. But the way that Enlightenment currently works is just unfun. And while I really liked my time on the Sorc, every time I had to play with Enlightenment, it was just making the experience worse for no reason, basically. So I hope that gets fixed. Obviously, all of the scaling bugs get fixed. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go into all the details now. We obviously need compensatory buffs for all that stuff. And then I would also like to see an overall meta shift. We had 1 year of Lightning Spear as the top build, almost in the game, basically. But especially on a Sorc, I don't know, with like slight variations, okay. But it was basically Lightning Spear all the time for like half the seasons of this game's life cycle. Something needs to happen here. So, you know, we don't want to see Lightning Spear as the number one thing, like, you know, again, basically. And on top of this, Lightning Spear also just like has this terrible, awkward boss damage problem that could also be addressed maybe with like, you know, a shift from AoE to single target damage, maybe reduce the number of arcs or something like that on the splintering energy. You know, there's many solutions to that, but I hope that something happens here. And lastly, the Spiritborn. So Spiritborn, as I had said in the intro, actually was the most fun class for me. It has not really changed much since Season 6, besides, you know, the power and like some of the scaling mechanisms and stuff. But most of the builds are largely the same, and well, they are actually pretty fun. So there's definitely some stuff that could happen here to make Spiritborn more interesting and bring it back. A lot of people were also complaining that the Spiritborn feels weak and undertuned and not even like T4 viable or so, which is something that I cannot really like say the same, I guess. I had a really good time on my Spiritborn, I gotta say. It definitely does have some of the weaker builds compared to some of the others I played. But, you know, for example here, like my Quill Volley was blasting through 80s in like 3 minutes or something. And I can like kill Belial in like 1 second on T4. Like, that is on hardcore as well. I don't really have any problems with this class, at least on the better builds. Now there are a bunch of builds that are just like not even T4 viable, like, you know, Rake and Razor Wings and these kind of things. I would definitely like to see some updates for these things and maybe a general bump up for the class. We already did get some upgrade in the recent patch, which was kind of nice. but more stuff could be done on the Spiritborn. It feels like it was kind of like left in the dust since the expansion when it comes to like just updating the class with like cool new builds. Like all the new stuff we have gotten in season 7 and season 8 was just kind of like worthless when it comes to actually creating new builds, for example, while other classes actually did get some interesting new stuff and interesting new builds. So the repertoire needs to be improved, I think. And like my suggestions, for example, would be just like nerf Quill a little bit, especially single target wise, and maybe like a hit wise, because we always come back to Quill for, you know, either proccing stuff like Andariels or something like that, or, you know, just it's just kind of like the overall best, because single target damage matters so much, boss damage matters so much. I would like to see that maybe a bit more balanced out with the other Spiritborn builds, especially poison builds need a bit of a bump up, for example, as well, because of how Noxious Resonance works. And then we could just raise the class as a whole a little bit, and that would be fine already. And then for like some future updates, you know, some cool new builds, there could be a lot of potential with, you know, Razor Wings, with, you know, something like Devourer. Like in general, all the ultimates besides the Hunter are just very whatever. So there could be cool stuff here that would make Spiritborn even more interesting to play for a lot of people, I think. In any case, that sums up my full feedback for Season 8. Overall, I gotta say, I had a relatively good time, but there's like a lot of low-hanging fruit that I hope Blizzard is going to address. There's a bunch of like overall game issues that we're probably not gonna see fixed in Season 9, but at the very least, maybe it's gonna put it on the radar for, you know, the next season, and then maybe the expansion, who knows. A lot of stuff that can improve this game. I really like Diablo 4 still, and I just hope it's gonna get better. So this is what I have to share here for now. Let me know what you think. Maybe you really agree or really disagree with some of my topics, or maybe I completely skipped something that you thought I should have mentioned. Let me know about it. Now is a good time, I guess, to also give some feedback, you know, with the PTR coming and all that. There might be actually some stuff of what I just described in there. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, for now, leave a comment if you have anything to share. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed this, and see you guys next time.